for another edition of Green White Checker. Coming a little bit late this time because it's kind of been a little bit of a busy day getting back from Charlotte and everything. But the Coca-Cola 600, or should I say the Coca-Cola 373.5, or whatever it ended up being, because it was run just a little over halfway through. But yeah, it's still a very interesting race, really a very interesting weekend in general up there in Charlotte this week. Yeah, it started off with the typical Charlotte fashion. Seems like the racing in Charlotte, even though it's still a little bit stale for a lot of people's opinion, I'm sure, because it tends to get really strung out in single file and kind of tends to be a little bit of a strategy race. If you're a person that likes strategy in particular, then this race weekend at Charlotte was heaven for you. But if you're somebody that just likes watching racing, and particularly more like the super speedway style racing where there's a lot more passing, a lot more side by side racing and everything, then it was probably a little bit of a snooze fest for you because it was a lot of single file stuff. But at the end of the day, still a very interesting race weekend up in Charlotte. It just kind of had a little bit of a disappointing end. Obviously, the biggest storyline coming into the weekend was Kyle Larson making the attempt at running the double. Yeah, he would have been the first NASCAR driver in a decade to have attempted this. The last one was Kurt Busch back in 2014. He was also looking to be the first Cup Series driver to actually complete the full 1,100 miles of racing since Tony Stewart did it back in 2001. Unfortunately, Mother Nature had its plans here. You know what they say, particularly with NASCAR. If you're ever in a drought, schedule a NASCAR race and it'll get you out of it. But, unfortunately, weather also wreaked havoc on the Indianapolis 500. As a matter of fact, the same weather system that ended up wreaking havoc with the Cup Series was actually the one that affected the Indianapolis 500 and pushed the start back a couple of hours. But unfortunately, because that weather up in Indianapolis delayed the start of the Coca-Cola 600, the Indianapolis 500, it forced Kyle Larson into a little bit of a difficult decision. He had to make the choice to either miss out on the start of the Coca-Cola 600 or skip the Indianapolis 500. Ultimately, he made the choice to race in the biggest race in motorsports in the world, the Indianapolis 500, and miss the start of the Coke 600. So what does that mean for Kyle Larson? Well, same as what happened with Chase Elliott last year when he got injured, broke his leg in the early going into the season, and when he got suspended later on in the season for dumping Denny Hamlin in last year's Coca-Cola 600. He's going to have to get a playoff waiver in order to be able to qualify for the playoffs. And so, yeah, if you're a Kyle Larson fan, I don't think there's any reason for you to be worried. I get it. Jordan Bianchi from The Athletic went out there and put out a very valid point earlier that because Kyle Larson chose another series over NASCAR, because Kyle Larson racing in NASCAR is his full-time job. He's contractually obligated to Hendrick Motorsports. He's contractually obligated to race in the Cup Series. And so choosing to race in another series over doing the NASCAR race it's kind of like choosing a side hustle and trying to just go with it over your full-time job because you like that side hustle more. Any other employer would fire you for that. And if you're NASCAR, Jordan Bianchi's point was it kind of sets a bad precedent that says, hey, you can race whatever and still have a chance to win a championship here in NASCAR, when very clearly NASCAR's rules are laid out that you have to start every single race in order to make it into the playoffs to be able to qualify. The only thing is that they haven't really followed that rule over the last couple of years. I already mentioned Chase Elliott, but think back to 2018 when Kyle Busch broke his foot at Daytona running in the Xfinity Series race there and ended up missing a little bit. He ended up having to get a waiver and in order to get into the playoffs. And when he did, he ended up winning the championship that year. And so, the precedent is already set that because they've done it for injuries and even for a suspension last year, granted Chase Elliott didn't end up needing it because he missed the playoffs anyway. But because they granted him a waiver, because they've granted Kyle Busch one, the precedent is set that Kyle Larson will get the waiver. And not only that, but just from a business and a logistical standpoint, if you're NASCAR, you would absolutely be stupid to deny Kyle Larson the waiver because, Kyle Larson is an absolute superstar of the sport. You heard the raucous cheer last week when his helicopter landed at North Wilkesboro. It was so loud you could hear it in the media center with the doors closed. It sounded like the fans were in there with us. It was kind of the similar situation when he arrived in Charlotte. The crowd absolutely roared and erupted. Kyle Larson has become such a superstar that, no secret there was another special guest on hand for the Coca-Cola 600 yesterday. Well, when it was announced that that guest, a.k.a. Donald Trump, would be showing up for the 600 on Monday of this past week, the immediate question a lot of people started asking, especially a lot of NASCAR reporters like Bob Pockrass and Jordan Bianchi, was, well, what does this mean for Kyle Larson getting there? Is that going to affect him? Kyle Larson is such a superstar. He's more popular with what a lot of people would call redneck NASCAR fans than Donald Trump, and that's saying something. So, yeah, if Kyle Larson is so popular with fans, and because Kyle Larson's so popular with fans like that, that NASCAR would be absolutely stupid to just absolutely deny him a waiver because of rules when they have the opportunity, with him being such a superstar, to market him being in the playoffs. So at the end of the day, if you're a Kyle Larson fan, I don't think there's any of you that are worried, but if you are, there's absolutely no reason for you to be worried. I mean, he's going to be in the playoffs. He's going to get the waiver. Nonetheless, I do agree with Jordan Bianchi, though, that really his priority, because it is his full-time job, should have been to race in the Cup race. But at the end of the day, you can't blame him for running the Indianapolis 500. Actually, the reason why he chose Indian to begin with is because he actually had kind of a contractual obligation with them. Yeah, he's got a 2-year deal, so he's going to be running this again next year. So sure, it was a bit of a bummer that weather denied him from being able to run even one lap in the Coca-Cola 600. But at the end of the day, we're going to get him having a chance to run the double again next year at least. So hopefully the storyline won't be the same and weather won't affect things next year. We'll see. It's May. You can't really predict what's going to happen at the beginning of summertime weather around here. But, still, tip of the cap to Kyle Larson for trying it. Yeah, this is his first foray into IndyCar, and you wouldn't be able to tell. I mean, the way he ran in qualifying, the way he carried himself in the race. Sure, unfortunately, he finished 18th because of just one mistake that he's still kicking himself over. He could have finished a lot higher, but at the end of the day, Kyle Larson did a very good job representing himself and NASCAR on the biggest stage in the world with the Indianapolis 500, and you can't blame him for choosing to get the opportunity to run the biggest race in the world. Sure, you'd argue the Daytona 500 could be bigger, but no. The Indianapolis 500 is by and large the biggest racing event in the world. And you just can't deny him the chance to run that, especially because look, he's bringing eyes to the Indianapolis 500 because people who are IndyCar fans don't even follow NASCAR now know who he is, and who knows? They probably would have tuned in for the Coca-Cola 600 had he even been able to run in it. So it's just it's another big marketing opportunity with Kyle Larson there too. So that's just how big of a superstar he is. Tip of the cap, he ran really well. And speaking of running really well, to have the morning of not known if he was going to be running or not today, the whole time the backup plan was to have Justin Allgaier as the backup driver for Kyle Larson. He ended up getting to run the entire distance that the Coca-Cola 600 ended up going, and he ran really well. I mean, he early in the early going, he was running. He was a lap down actually. He was running kind of at the middle of the pack. He was struggling, but in the early going in the Coca-Cola 600, a lot of the guys struggle. It's just the nature, the character of Charlotte Motor Speedway, especially when you start there in the day. The track is really, when it's hot, it's really hard to find grip. You're running real loose, just trying to find any kind of groove that you can. And that's why, especially in the early going, you see the cars getting strung out to the point where there's a second or more lead for some of them. And as the track temperatures cool and it gets more rubberized, and slowly it starts becoming more tight and harder to grip, especially up at the top. And Charlotte Motor Speedway, not unlike North Wilkesboro. Sorry, guys, I went to North Greenville University. For some reason, that popped in my head. North Wilkesboro Speedway last week, a track with a lot of character. Yeah, a lot of bumps and scrapes and scratches along the way that even with the repave they managed to keep. Charlotte's got a lot of that same character too. There's a lot of bumps and bangs along the way, especially in the middle of the backstretch. And it's just one of those things that makes Charlotte a very difficult track to prepare for, because not only do you have the changing track conditions as the race goes on, but you also you have a track that if you don't have the setup right for it, it takes you a little while to figure it out, especially in a race like the Coca-Cola 600 where it's an endurance type of race and you're supposed to be able to try to adjust them for the long haul. At the end of the day, that's just how Charlotte is. It's a weird track to prepare for. It's hard to set up for, and Justin Allgaier in the early going was no exception to that. But in very similar fashion to what happened, and I'm going to give a local shout out here to Jeremy Clements. I work for an outlet that sponsors Jeremy Clements, Fox Sports Spartanburg 98.3 FM. But Jeremy Clements was struggling all day long, really all weekend long. Yeah, the Xfinity race, just like the Cup race, no exception. A lot of the guys were struggling to find handling early on. Jeremy Clements just couldn't find any middle ground or setup that could work at all. Yeah, in practice, he was running way too tight. In qualifying, he was way too loose. During the race, the car basically had no turn radius whatsoever. And yeah, as Jeremy was telling me, as the tire was start to wear down on you, you want to try to grip it and rip it up at the top of the track near the wall. And if your car is running tight to the point where you have no turn radius, it makes it very difficult to be able to do that. So Jeremy was just kind of riding in the back of the pack, back in the almost back in the 30s for a lot of the race. Ended up a lap down, but all day long just fought and scrapped his way through. Ended up salvaging a 13th place finish out of it, one of the hardest fought 13th place finishes you'll ever get. And that was actually the best finish that he's had since he finished sixth in Atlanta back in February, which oddly enough was the last race that I was able to cover in person. But yeah, it's a tip of the cap to Jeremy Clements on that. But Justin Allgaier kind of had a very similar run, filling in for Kyle Larson. He was ended up a lap down, but then kind of late in the race, he realized that his job in filling in for Larson was to get the car into a position where, yeah, when Larson got there, that he would be able to possibly win the race, to keep him in a position to do that. And of course, if you're a lap down, you're not going to be able to. So, yeah, he was able to kind of start figuring some things out, working his way back out there. He got back on the lead lap, got up inside the top 15, and then the lightning came and put the race on hold. At the time, Allgaier was running 13th, and that was all she wrote. And so Justin Allgaier ends up finishing 13th in place of Kyle Larson. Very good run there. And obviously, this is going to be some things that get some big eyes on him. Allgaier had a very good go in the Xfinity race on Saturday, too, until he ended up being the last caution of the race. Got turned around there, ended up DNFing, but he was one of the fastest. He actually was the fastest car in the field all race long. So, Justin Allgaier, very talented driver, and I think this is going to be something that's going to get some eyes on him and some guys that are looking to possibly pick him up to give him a cup ride next year. And speaking of which, he's going to have some opportunities with that because it's expected that Stuart Haas is possibly going to disband all of their charters. They're going to end up kind of divesting. The expectation is that possibly on Tuesday this week, they're going to make some sort of announcement to their employees and their staff about what their future intentions are. And it's expected that they're going to end up divesting and getting rid of their charters. And so with the ongoing charter debate going on in NASCAR right now, they're looking into limiting teams to 3 charters, with the exception of Joe Gibbs Racing and Hendrick Motorsports, because they would be grandfathered into the old system that exists because they've been around for so long. So they would have the exception to that. But for the other teams that are newer, they would be limited to 3 charters. And there are some of them that are looking to possibly expand. Spire possibly could do it. 2311 could be looking into it. Trackhouse, any one of those guys could possibly be a contender to possibly pick up Justin Allgaier in the future. So he probably got some eyes on him. He probably turned a few heads with the way that he ran in relief of Kyle Larson, and I think that bodes well for his future and possibly getting into the Cup Series. And now for the most controversial part that came from the Coca-Cola 600. Well, actually, first let's touch on the winner. Christopher Bell. A lot of people are going to sit here, and because the race was called after just a little past halfway, you're going to want to tend to put an asterisk next to this for the winner being Christopher Bell. But realistically, this race far from merits an asterisk for him, because he actually led the most laps in this race. He led 90 laps. He won a stage. He was running in the top 5 for most of the race. He had one of the best cars out there. It's really hard to say that Christopher Bell wasn't somebody that was going to be deserving of winning that race. Yeah, it's not like he lucked into it or anything. He earned his way up there to the front. And honestly, I think that's for that reason alone, regardless of why the race was shortened, regardless of whether or not you like that it was shortened, Christopher Bell rightfully should be looked at as a legitimate winner in this thing. It may not have gone to the scheduled distance, but he had one of the best cars in the field. He probably would have been up there in the end. And he did lead the most laps in the race up to that point. So at the end of the day, I think that Christopher Bell, this should be it's actually really kind of a season-changing potential win for him, because they've been struggling here this season, that 20 team. And to have a big win and a big profile crown jewel event like this, regardless of how it comes, could be something that can completely flip your season on its head. Because the way that they were running all race long shows that race team has got the potential, and there's potential that they could flip it around. possibly be somebody to look out for going down the stretch. But going to why the race was called when it was, I understand where a lot of the fans are coming from about being frustrated that they didn't try to carry this thing out, especially when if you're a fan looking out there at the racetrack, it looked like it was starting to dry out by the point that they did. But realistically, yeah, obviously, if you were there, then you know you're a fan. All day long, it was so humid that you instantly started sweating as soon as you walked out of a door. I mean, I was out there taking pictures for most of the race out there on pit road. As soon as I left the media center, I was pouring sweat. Like it was just that kind of a hot day. And if there was that much moisture in the air to the point where you could actually see it in the lights, yeah, that goes to show that that's not helping things with the track drying situation. So, yeah, NASCAR when they put it out there for their reasoning, said that due to the likelihood of resuming after 1 o'clock a.m., they didn't exactly say when after 1 o'clock a.m. That could have meant they could be starting at 3 o'clock. It just depended upon how long it could take them to get the track dried. And the reality of this is, and I'm going to give you a perspective that as a fan you probably aren't thinking of because you're not media, so you don't see what we do. But let me just clue you in on kind of how things go post race for media. Most of us that are in there, we have to get our quotes and get our stories and our articles and our photos and everything ready. We have a strict deadline to get that stuff out there. Particularly for newspaper writers, that deadline is usually like 4 o'clock in the morning so that they can make it to the next morning's print edition. And so they have to have all that stuff filed before then. And even if you're me and you write for a radio station and take photos and everything, you still would rather get all that stuff done the night before instead of doing it all the next day at home. And so at the end of the day, most of us, we sit in the media center and we're working for 2.5 to 3 hours after the race on average. Like usually, like last night in particular, the last 3 people out of the media center were me, Jordan Bianchi, and Bob Pockris. Yeah, Bob Pockris is usually always one of the last ones out of there. That man pretty much never stops working. It's one of the things that's kind of admirable about him. But at the end of the day, it takes us 2.5 to 3 hours to really get our job done after the race. And if the race had resumed, even if it had resumed at 1 o'clock, there were still 130 some odd laps left in the race. Realistically, even if it went caution free, that's still probably putting another hour and a half worth of racing. So you're looking at the race ending at like 2:30, somewhere between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. And from the perspective of media alone, that puts us at leaving the track at no earlier than 5:30, maybe even closer to 6 o'clock in the morning. It's an all-nighter at that point. And if we do that, especially if you have that 4 o'clock deadline, congratulations, you missed it. So your stuff's not getting printed until the next day, and your outlet's mad at you. So it's just a little glimpse into one thing that may have factored into the decision is that NASCAR was thinking of the media working the event, but also you got to think that most of these drivers and teams all have families. They've been at the track all weekend. Most of them would like to get home to their families. You don't want to be sitting at the track till 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning to finish this race out when it's not necessary. The race was beyond halfway. By rule, it was official. And especially for the fans sitting out there and sweating to death in the humidity, don't keep people sitting out there till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning if you don't have to. So I think it was absolutely the right decision by NASCAR just from the work standpoint of it alone. But then you add in the family aspect and you add in the fan safety aspect, because sitting out there in that heat's just not healthy for you, especially when a lot of people sitting in those stands probably weren't pouring fluids into themselves. So at the end of the day, it sucks. You want to see it carried out to completion, but NASCAR absolutely made the right call on this one. Well, that's going to do it for the Coca-Cola 600. NASCAR turns the page. The Xfinity Series will go to Portland Raceway next week up in the Northwest. And the Cup Series will be at Worldwide Technology Raceway out in the St. Louis area, so we'll get to talk about that next week. I'm not going to be back at the track in person probably until September, but I'll continue to break down the races and do these as every single week as normal. But that's going to do it for this week. We'll catch you next time.